The fog covered the street when the baby stroller appeared, rolling towards the sidewalk with no one around. The policeman in a clean uniform approached in silence, looking at the unlatched gate of the house. A few meters away, a German shepherd stood firm beside the stroller, ears pricked. In a swift move, the policeman drew his taser and fired. The dog fell without a sound, its eyes fixed. Inside the house, a lady stopped when she heard the crack and ran. The baby, now standing, looked at the fallen body. And then, with both hands, he picked up the weapon that shone on the ground. Love stories with animals. Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now, back to our story. That Tuesday morning began like so many others in the tree-lined neighborhood of Maplewood Heights, a quiet suburban area on the outskirts of Cincinnati, Ohio. The streets were still covered by a thin morning mist, and the sound of birds chirping was interrupted only by the occasional bark from Rex, the German shepherd who lived in the corner house. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Rex for his unwavering loyalty to Eleanor Matthews, the retired schoolteacher who had raised him from a puppy. Eleanor, or Ellie as her neighbors called her, was a 72-year-old woman with silver hair always neatly pulled back in a bun and kind blue eyes that seemed to hold both wisdom and deep sadness. After the tragic loss of her daughter Jennifer in a car accident 3 years ago, Ellie had taken on the responsibility of raising her grandson Tommy, who was now 18 months old. The little boy had his mother's bright green eyes and his father's sandy blonde hair, though his father had disappeared from their lives shortly after Jennifer's passing, unable to cope with the responsibility of single parenthood. The routine at the Matthews house was sacred and predictable. Every morning at 7 o'clock sharp, Ellie would prepare coffee in her vintage percolator, the same one she had used for the past 40 years. The baby stroller remained in its designated corner of the wraparound porch, always locked and ready for their afternoon walks around the neighborhood. Rex, ever vigilant, would position himself near the white picket fence gate, his ears perked up and alert to any unusual movement or sound. Neighbors often commented on how well-organized and peaceful the Matthews household seemed. Mrs. Henderson, from across the street, would wave from her garden every morning as she tended to her prized roses. Mr. Peterson, the retired postal worker who lived 2 houses down, would tip his baseball cap when he walked past during his morning jog. The Johnson family next door would smile and wave as they loaded their twin daughters into their minivan for school. But there was something different about this particular Tuesday morning. The mist seemed thicker than usual, and Rex's barking had a more urgent quality to it. Ellie noticed it as she stood in her kitchen, stirring cream into her coffee and watching through the window as her grandson played with his favorite stuffed elephant in the living room. "What's gotten into you this morning, boy?" she murmured to herself, watching as Rex paced back and forth near the gate, his tail low and his posture tense. The morning routine continued as usual despite Rex's apparent unease. Ellie fed Tommy his breakfast of mashed bananas and oatmeal, cleaned up the inevitable mess that came with feeding a toddler, and then settled him in his playpen while she tidied up the kitchen. Rex remained outside, his vigilant watch continuing without interruption. At exactly 8:15, Ellie noticed something that made her pause mid-step as she carried the breakfast dishes to the sink. The front gate, which she distinctly remembered latching securely the night before, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, but definitely not properly closed. She set down the dishes and walked to the front door, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "That's odd," she said to herself, opening the screen door and stepping onto the porch. Rex immediately trotted over to her, his tail wagging but his eyes still alert and focused on the street beyond. As Ellie approached the gate, she noticed something even more disturbing. Tommy's stroller, which she had carefully positioned in the corner of the porch and locked in place, was now sitting several feet away from the house, almost at the edge of the property line. The safety brake was still engaged. But somehow, the stroller had moved significantly from its usual spot. "This doesn't make sense," Ellie whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the stroller handle. There had been no strong wind during the night, and the stroller was too heavy to move on its own, especially with the brake engaged. Rex circled around her legs, whining softly and looking up at her with his intelligent brown eyes. He seemed to be trying to tell her something, but she couldn't understand what. The street was unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning. Most of the neighbors had already left for work, and the school buses had completed their routes. Only a few cars were parked along the curb, and everything appeared normal on the surface. Ellie checked the stroller thoroughly, making sure it hadn't been damaged or tampered with. Everything seemed to be in order mechanically. But the fact that it had moved without explanation left her feeling uneasy. She carefully wheeled it back to its usual position and engaged the brake once more, this time checking it twice to make sure it was secure. As she turned to go back inside, she noticed a black sedan parked at the far end of the street that she didn't recognize. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside, but something about the vehicle made her feel uncomfortable. It seemed out of place in their quiet neighborhood, where everyone knew each other's cars. "Come on, Rex," she called to her loyal companion. "Let's go check on Tommy." Rex followed her inside, but he kept looking back toward the street, his ears still perked up and alert. Ellie found Tommy exactly where she had left him, sitting contentedly in his playpen and babbling to his stuffed elephant. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, scooping him up in her arms. "A good nap?" Tommy giggled and reached for her, a habit that never failed despite her growing concern about the morning's strange event. As she held her grandson close, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling. Locked gate, moved stroller, the unfamiliar. It all seemed too coincidental to. She had lived in Maplewood, and she had never experienced anything like this before. The neighborhood had always been safe and peaceful. Children played in the streets until dark, neighbors looked out for each other, and crime was practically non-existent. The local police rarely had anything more serious to deal with than the occasional noise complaint or minor traffic violation. But now, as Ellie looked out her front window while Tommy played at her feet, she noticed that the black sedan was still there, and it seemed to be positioned in a way that provided a clear view of her house. The feeling of unease that had been growing throughout the morning intensified, and she found herself holding Tommy a little tighter. Rex remained by the window, his attention focused on the street outside. His behavior was so unusual that Ellie began to wonder if he sensed something she couldn't. Dogs were known for their ability to detect things that humans missed, and Rex had always been particularly intuitive. "What do you think, boy?" she asked, scratching behind his ears. "Is something out there?" Rex looked up at her with his expressive eyes and then back toward the window, as if confirming her suspicions. The morning that had started so peacefully was beginning to feel like the calm before a storm, and Ellie couldn't help but wonder what the rest of the day would bring. The black sedan remained parked at the end of Maple Street for another 20 minutes before slowly driving away. Ellie watched from her window as it disappeared around the corner, but the uneasy feeling in her chest didn't dissipate. She tried to push her concerns aside and focus on Tommy, who was now crawling around the living room with his characteristic determination, babbling happily to himself. Around 9:30, Ellie decided to step outside and check the mailbox. It was earlier than usual for mail delivery, but she wanted to get some fresh air and perhaps talk to one of her neighbors about the strange morning events. Tommy was content playing with his blocks, and Rex could watch over him while she stepped onto the porch. As she opened the front door, she immediately noticed that the gate was open again, not just slightly ajar this time, but completely open. Swinging gently in the mild morning breeze, her heart began to race as she realized that Tommy's stroller had somehow moved again, this time positioned just outside the gate, on the sidewalk. "Rex!" she called urgently, but her loyal companion was nowhere to be seen. Panic began to set in as she quickly glanced around the yard and called his name again. "Rex, where are you, boy?" She hurried back inside to check on Tommy, who was exactly where she had left him, safely playing in the living room. But Rex was not with him as she had expected. The German Shepherd had vanished without a trace, and both the gate and stroller had been moved again. Ellie's hands shook as she picked up Tommy and held him close. Something was terribly wrong, and she needed to find Rex immediately. She grabbed her phone and stepped back outside, calling Rex's name as loudly as she could. "Rex! Come here, boy! Rex!" From somewhere nearby, she heard the sound of urgent barking. It was definitely Rex, but the barking sounded distressed, almost panicked. She followed the sound, carrying Tommy and moving as quickly as she could down the sidewalk. The barking was coming from the direction of the community park at the end of the street. As Ellie rounded the corner, she saw Rex standing protectively in front of Tommy's stroller, which was now positioned near the park entrance. The German Shepherd's hackles were raised, and he was barking at someone Ellie couldn't see from her position. "Rex!" she called out, relief flooding through her voice. "Come here, boy!" But before Rex could respond to her call, she heard a man's voice shouting commands. "Get back! Stay back!" Ellie quickened her pace, her heart pounding with fear and confusion. As she got closer, she could see a police officer standing about 10 feet away from Rex, his hand positioned on something at his belt. The officer was tall and muscular, with closely cropped dark hair and a clean uniform that looked almost too pristine for a working patrol officer. "Officer," Ellie called out, hurrying toward them. "That's my dog. He's not aggressive." The officer, whose name tag read Stevens, turned to look at her with cold, calculating eyes. "Ma'am, you need to control your animal." He was behaving aggressively toward this abandoned stroller. "Abandoned?" Ellie gasped, looking at Tommy's stroller in confusion. "That's not abandoned. That's my grandson's stroller. I don't understand how it got here." Rex continued to bark, positioning himself between Officer Stevens and the stroller. His behavior was protective, not aggressive, but Ellie could see that the officer either didn't understand the difference or didn't care. "Please." "Officer Stevens," Ellie said, reading his name tag. "Rex is a gentle dog. He's just protecting the stroller because he knows it belongs to my grandson. There must be some misunderstanding." "Ma'am, I need you to step back while I handle this situation," Stevens replied, his voice cold and authoritative. "This dog has been acting aggressively, and I have the right to defend myself." Ellie noticed that Stevens was holding what appeared to be a taser, and her blood ran cold. "Please don't hurt him. Rex, come here." Rex looked back at her, his intelligent eyes showing confusion and distress. He took a step toward her, but Stevens suddenly shouted, "He's attacking!" "No!" Ellie screamed. But it was too late. The sharp crack of the taser filled the air, and Rex collapsed to the ground with a yelp of pain. His body convulsed briefly before going still, his eyes open but unfocused. "Rex!" Ellie ran to her beloved companion's side, Tommy still in her arms. The little boy began to cry, sensing his grandmother's distress. "Why did you do that?" Ellie demanded, tears streaming down her face as she knelt beside Rex. "He wasn't attacking anyone." Officer Stevens holstered his taser and pulled out a notepad, seemingly unmoved by the scene before him. "I observed the animal behaving aggressively toward public property. I acted in accordance with department policy regarding dangerous animals." "Dangerous?" Ellie's voice cracked with emotion. "Rex has never hurt anyone in his life. He was protecting the stroller because he knows it belongs to my grandson." Several neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Henderson from across the street hurried over, her face pale with shock. "Ellie, what happened? Is Rex okay?" "This officer used a taser on Rex," Ellie explained, her voice shaking. "He claimed Rex was being aggressive, but he was just protecting Tommy's stroller." Mrs. Henderson looked at the scene with obvious confusion. But why was Tommy Stroller here at the park? And where did this officer come from? I've never seen a police car in the neighborhood this morning. Officer Stevens looked up from his notepad with an irritated expression. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back while I complete my report. This is an official police matter. But my dog, Ellie pleaded, gently touching Rex's still form. He needs veterinary attention. Please, at least let me take him to the vet. The animal will be fine, Stevens replied dismissively. Tasers are non-lethal and cause only temporary incapacitation. But Rex wasn't moving, and his breathing seemed shallow and labored. Ellie could see that he was in distress, and she knew she needed to get him help immediately. Mr. Peterson, the retired postal worker, had arrived and was studying the scene with a puzzled expression. Officer, could you explain how this stroller ended up here? I saw Mrs. Matthews with it on her porch earlier this morning. Stevens looked annoyed by the question. I'm not required to explain my observations to civilians. The animal was behaving aggressively toward abandoned property, and I responded appropriately. But it's not abandoned property, Mrs. Henderson interjected. Everyone in the neighborhood knows that's Tommy's stroller. Tommy, who had been crying in Ellie's arms, suddenly stopped and looked down at Rex with his bright green eyes. In a move that surprised everyone, the toddler reached out toward the ground where Stevens had dropped his taser after holstering it. No, sweetheart, Ellie said gently, shifting Tommy away from the device. But the little boy was persistent, stretching toward the taser with both hands. Tommy wants to help Rex, Mrs. Henderson observed, her voice soft with emotion. Before anyone could stop him, Tommy had somehow managed to grab the taser from the ground. With the determination that only a determined toddler could possess, he held it out toward his grandmother, babbling urgently as if trying to tell her something important. Thank you, sweetheart, Ellie whispered, taking the device from his small hands. As she held it, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The taser was still warm, but there was something else. A small scratch on the side that looked fresh, as if it had been recently damaged or modified. Officer Stevens reached for the taser impatiently. I'll need that back, Mom. That's official police equipment. But Ellie held onto it for a moment longer, studying the device carefully. Something about this entire situation felt wrong. From the mysteriously moved stroller to the officer's overly aggressive response to Rex's protective behavior, I think we need to get Rex to the veterinarian immediately, she said firmly, handing the taser back to Stevens. Mr. Peterson, would you mind helping me get him to Dr. Morrison's clinic? Of course, Ellie, Mr. Peterson replied without hesitation. I'll get my car. As they carefully lifted Rex onto a blanket and carried him toward Mr. Peterson's vehicle, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random incident. The timing, the circumstances, and Officer Stevens' behavior all seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Tommy continued to babble and point toward Rex, as if he understood that something important had happened and that his beloved canine companion needed help. The little boy's perceptiveness seemed beyond his 18 months of age, and Ellie found herself wondering what else he might have observed that she had missed. Dr. Harrison Morrison had been the neighborhood veterinarian for over 15 years, and his clinic on Elm Street was a familiar refuge for pet owners throughout Maplewood Heights. When Mr. Peterson's car pulled up to the clinic with Rex lying motionless in the back seat, Dr. Morrison immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. What happened to Rex? He asked, helping them carry the German Shepherd into the examination room. A police officer used a taser on him, Ellie explained, her voice still shaking with emotion. He claimed Rex was being aggressive, but I know that's not true. Rex was just protecting Tommy's stroller. Dr. Morrison, a gentle man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying temples, carefully examined Rex while listening to Ellie's account of the morning's events. His expression grew increasingly concerned as he checked the dog's vital signs and examined the marks left by the taser. "This is very troubling," he said finally, looking up at Ellie with a frown. "Rex's heart rate is irregular and his breathing is shallow. Tasers are supposed to be non-lethal, but they can cause serious complications, especially in older dogs." "Rex is only 7 years old," Ellie protested. "He's not old. You're right, but he's a large breed, and any electrical shock can be dangerous. I'm going to need to keep him here for observation and treatment," Dr. Morrison explained. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of him." As Dr. Morrison prepared to administer treatment, Ellie noticed something else that struck her as odd. "Doctor, is it normal for police officers to carry tasers in this neighborhood? I've lived here for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this before." "That's what I was wondering too," Mr. Peterson added. "I didn't see any police car on the street this morning, and I was out jogging around 8:30. Where did this officer come from?" Dr. Morrison paused in his work and looked at them thoughtfully. "You know, that's a very good question. My brother-in-law is a sergeant with the Cincinnati Police Department, and he's mentioned that they don't typically patrol residential areas like Maplewood Heights unless there's been a specific complaint or emergency call." "So what was Officer Stevens doing in our neighborhood?" Ellie asked. "I think we need to find out," Dr. Morrison replied. "Let me make a phone call." While Dr. Morrison contacted his brother-in-law, Ellie sat in the waiting room with Tommy, who had been unusually quiet since the incident. The little boy kept looking toward the examination room where Rex was being treated, as if he understood that his protector was in trouble. "He's going to be okay, sweetheart," Ellie whispered, holding Tommy close. "Rex is strong, and Dr. Morrison is taking good care of him." 20 minutes later, Dr. Morrison returned with a troubled expression. "I spoke with my brother-in-law, Sergeant Williams. He checked the patrol records for this morning, and there was no Officer Stevens assigned to duty in our area. In fact, there was no patrol scheduled for Maplewood Heights at all today." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean?" "It means either this officer was working outside his assigned area or something else is going on here," Dr. Morrison replied. "Sergeant Williams is going to look into it." "But why would a police officer be in our neighborhood if he wasn't supposed to be there?" Mr. Peterson asked. Before anyone could answer, the clinic door opened, and Sarah Wilson, the owner of Wilson's Flower Shop, hurried inside. Sarah was a petite woman in her 40s with curly red hair and a warm smile, but today she looked worried and out of breath. "Ellie, I heard what happened," she said, rushing over to them. "Mrs. Henderson called me at the shop. How is Rex?" "Dr. Morrison is taking care of him," Ellie replied. "But Sarah, this whole situation is very strange. The officer who did this wasn't supposed to be in our neighborhood." Sarah's expression grew even more concerned. "That's actually why I came over. I have something to show you." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos. "Whoa, I was arranging flowers in the front window this morning when I noticed that black sedan parked at the end of your street. It seemed out of place, so I took a picture." She showed them a photo of the black sedan that Ellie had noticed earlier. "But look at this," Sarah continued, swiping to the next photo. "About 30 minutes later, I saw the same car parked behind my shop, and there was a man in a police uniform getting out of it." "Was it Officer Stevens?" Ellie asked. "I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was tall and had dark hair, just like you described," Sarah replied. "What's really strange is that he seemed to be watching your house through binoculars. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but they painted a disturbing picture." "So this officer was surveilling my house before the incident?" Ellie asked. "It certainly looks that way," Dr. Morrison said. "And now we know he wasn't supposed to be on duty in this area." Tommy, who had been sitting quietly in Ellie's lap, suddenly became animated. He pointed towards Sarah's phone and babbled excitedly, as if he recognized something in the photos. "What is it, sweetheart?" Ellie asked, following his gaze. Tommy continued to point at the phone, and Sarah scrolled through her photos again. When she reached a photo taken from a different angle, Tommy became even more excited. "Look at this," Sarah said, zooming in on the image. "There's someone else in the passenger seat of that car." Indeed, barely visible through the tinted windows, they could make out the silhouette of another person sitting in the passenger seat of the black sedan. "So Officer Stevens wasn't working alone," Mr. Peterson observed. "This is definitely not a random incident." "But why would they target Rex?" Ellie wondered aloud. "He's just a dog. And why move Tommy's stroller?" Dr. Morrison looked thoughtful. "Maybe they weren't targeting Rex specifically. Maybe they were targeting you, Ellie. Think about it. If something had happened to Tommy because the stroller was moved, Rex would have been blamed as the dangerous dog who failed to protect him. The implications of this theory were terrifying. You mean they deliberately put Tommy in danger to frame Rex?" "It's possible," Dr. Morrison replied. "But the question is why? What would someone gain by discrediting you and Rex?" Sarah suddenly looked up from her phone with a startled expression. "Ellie, do you remember receiving any unusual mail lately? Letters from companies or organizations you didn't recognize?" "Actually, yes," Ellie replied, thinking back over the past few weeks. "I've been getting letters from some real estate company asking if I'm interested in selling my house. I threw them away because I have no intention of selling." "What was the name of the company?" Sarah asked urgently. "I don't remember exactly, but it was something like Premier Properties or Prestige Development," Ellie said. "Why?" Sarah's face had gone pale. "Because I've been getting the same letters, and so have several other people in the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it to me last week, and the Johnson family got one too." "That's interesting," Dr. Morrison said. It sounds like someone is trying to buy up properties in your neighborhood. But why would they go to such extreme lengths?" Mr. Peterson asked. "If they want to buy houses, why not just make legitimate offers? Unless they're trying to pressure people into selling at below-market prices," Sarah suggested. "If residents start to believe the neighborhood is becoming unsafe, they might be more willing to sell cheaply." The thought was chilling. "So you think this whole incident was designed to make us afraid?" Ellie asked. "It's possible," Dr. Morrison replied. "And if Rex had been seriously injured or labeled as a dangerous dog, it would have given them even more ammunition to argue that the neighborhood is unsafe." Tommy suddenly began to fuss, and Ellie realized he was probably hungry. It was almost noon, and they had been at the clinic for over 2 hours. "I should take Tommy home and get him some lunch," she said. "Will you call me as soon as there's any change in Rex's condition?" "Of course," Dr. Morrison assured her. "And Ellie, I think you should consider filing a complaint about Officer Stevens. What he did was not justified. And if he wasn't supposed to be in your neighborhood, there are serious questions that need to be answered." "I'll drive you home," Mr. Peterson offered. "And I think we should all keep our eyes open for any more suspicious activity." As they prepared to leave the clinic, Sarah made one more observation that sent a chill through all of them. "Ellie, I just thought of something. That real estate company that's been sending letters, I looked them up online after I got mine. They specialize in acquiring properties for large-scale development projects." "What kind of projects?" Ellie asked. "Shopping centers, office complexes, luxury condominiums," Sarah replied. "The kind of developments that would require buying up entire neighborhoods." The ride home was quiet, with each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they had discovered. As Mr. Peterson pulled into Ellie's driveway, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. "The gate is closed," she said, pointing to her front yard. "And the stroller is back in its usual spot on the porch." That's impossible, Mr. Peterson said, looking confused. We left everything exactly as it was when we took Rex to the clinic. Which means someone has been in my yard while we were gone, Ellie realized, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Tommy looked up at her with his bright green eyes, and she could swear she saw understanding in his innocent gaze. Somehow, her 18-month-old grandson seemed to comprehend that their peaceful life in Maplewood Heights was under threat, and that the incident with Rex was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. The discovery that someone had been in Ellie's yard while they were at the veterinary clinic sent a wave of unease through the small group. Mr. Peterson insisted on walking through the property with Ellie to check for any signs of tampering or damage before he left her alone with Tommy. Everything looks normal, he said, examining the gate latch and the porch area. But I don't like the idea of you being here by yourself, especially with Tommy. I'll be fine, Ellie replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Besides, what else can I do? This is my home. After Mr. Peterson left, Ellie tried to establish some normalcy by feeding Tommy lunch and putting him down for his afternoon nap, but she found herself constantly checking the windows and jumping at every small sound. The peaceful sanctuary that had been her home for 30 years now felt vulnerable and exposed. Around 2 o'clock, her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a man in an expensive suit standing on her porch with a briefcase. He was tall and thin, with slicked-back grey hair and a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Matthews," he said when she opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. "My name is Richard Blackwood from Prestige Development Corporation. I believe you've received our letters about potentially selling your property." "I'm not interested in selling," Ellie replied firmly. "I already threw those letters away." "I understand your reluctance, Mrs. Matthews, but I'm here to make you an offer that might change your mind," Blackwood said, his smile becoming more aggressive. "We're prepared to offer you significantly more than market value for your property." "I said I'm not interested," Ellie repeated, starting to close the door. "Mrs. Matthews, please hear me out," Blackwood said, placing his foot against the doorframe. "I'm aware that you've had some unfortunate incidents in the neighborhood recently. The attack by your dog, for instance." Ellie's blood ran cold. "Rex didn't attack anyone. He was protecting my grandson's stroller." "Well, that's certainly one way to look at it," Blackwood replied with a shrug. "But the official police report will show that a dangerous animal was subdued after displaying aggressive behavior. These kinds of incidents can really affect property values, you know?" "How do you know about the police report?" Ellie demanded. "That just happened this morning." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "Word travels fast in small communities, Mrs. Matthews. The point is, selling now would be in your best interest, especially with a young child in the house. We wouldn't want any more unfortunate incidents, would we?" The threatening undertone in his voice was unmistakable. "Are you threatening me?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. "Of course not," Blackwood replied smoothly. "I'm simply pointing out that neighborhoods can change very quickly. What seems safe today might not be safe tomorrow." "Get off my property," Ellie said firmly, closing the door and engaging the deadbolt. Through the window, she watched Blackwood walk slowly back to a black sedan parked at the curb. It wasn't the same car Sarah had photographed, but it was similar enough to make Ellie's heart race. As he got into the passenger seat, she caught a glimpse of the driver, a man who looked remarkably like Officer Stevens, though he was now wearing civilian clothes. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her phone to call Sarah. "Sarah, he was just here, the man from the real estate company." "What did he want?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. "He tried to pressure me into selling the house. He even mentioned what happened to Rex this morning and made some veiled threats," Ellie explained. "And Sarah, I think Officer Stevens was driving the car." This is getting very serious, Ellie. I think we need to contact the police. The real police. But who can we trust? If Stevens is working with these people, how do we know other officers aren't involved too? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Let me call my cousin Jake. He's a detective with the state police. He's not part of the local department, so he should be safe. While Sarah made her call, Ellie checked on Tommy, who was still sleeping peacefully in his crib. The innocence of his sleeping face made her more determined than ever to protect him and their home. 20 minutes later, Sarah arrived with a tall, serious-looking man in his 40s. He had Sarah's red hair and kind eyes, but his expression was all business. Mrs. Matthews, I'm Detective Jake Wilson, he said, showing her his badge. Sarah told me what's been happening. I'd like to hear your version of events. Ellie recounted the entire morning, from the mysteriously moved stroller to the visit from Richard Blackwood. Detective Wilson took careful notes and asked detailed questions about Officer Stevens' behavior and appearance. I ran a check on Officer Bradley Stevens, he said when she finished. He's a real officer, but he's been suspended twice for excessive force. More importantly, he was supposed to be on administrative duty today, not patrol. So, he was definitely acting outside his authority, Ellie said. It appears so, and this Prestige Development Corporation is interesting too. They're registered as a legitimate business, but they've been involved in several questionable land acquisitions in other parts of the state. Sarah leaned forward. What kind of questionable acquisitions? Properties where the owners suddenly became motivated to sell after experiencing various problems, break-ins, vandalism, harassment by individuals claiming to be city officials, Detective Wilson explained. The pattern is always the same, pressure tactics designed to make people want to leave. And you think that's what's happening here? Ellie asked. It's certainly possible. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental. Your dog is attacked by a rogue police officer, and within hours, a real estate developer shows up at your door with threats disguised as concern. Tommy began to cry from his bedroom, and Ellie went to get him. When she returned with the toddler in her arms, Detective Wilson was examining the photos Sarah had taken that morning. These are very helpful, he said. I'll have them analyzed to see if we can identify the second person in the car. Tommy looked at Detective Wilson with curiosity, then suddenly pointed at one of the photos and babbled excitedly. What is it, sweetheart? Ellie asked, following his gaze. He's pointing at this photo of the black sedan, Detective Wilson observed. Does he recognize something? Tommy continued to point and babble, becoming more animated. Sarah looked at the photo more carefully. Wait, there's something in the background I hadn't noticed before. She showed them a white van parked several houses down from the black sedan. That van has some kind of logo on the side. Detective Wilson used his phone to zoom in on the image. It looks like a utility company logo. Let me see if I can make out the name. Apex Utilities, he read finally. Andy, I'll check to see if they had any legitimate service calls in your neighborhood yesterday. But why would a utility van be connected to this? Ellie wondered. If they're planning to redevelop the entire neighborhood, they might have been surveying the existing infrastructure, Detective Wilson suggested. Or they could have been using the van as cover for surveillance. The thought that her neighborhood had been under surveillance for who knows how long was deeply unsettling. How long do you think they've been watching us? Hard to say. But based on what you've told me, this appears to be a well-orchestrated operation, Detective Wilson replied. They knew your routines, they knew about Rex's protective nature, and they had Officer Stevens ready to respond when they created the situation. Created the situation? Sarah asked. Think about it, Detective Wilson explained. The stroller didn't move itself. Someone deliberately moved it to create a scenario where Rex would react protectively, giving Stevens justification to use his taser. But that means they put Tommy in danger, Ellie said, her voice filled with horror. Unfortunately, yes. They were willing to use a child as bait to achieve their goal. The reality of what had happened was almost too much to process. These people had deliberately endangered Tommy to further their real estate scheme, and they had used Rex's love for the little boy against him. "What can we do?" Ellie asked. "How do we stop them?" "First, we need to gather more evidence," Detective Wilson said. "I'll investigate Officer Stevens and this Prestige Development Corporation more thoroughly. In the meantime, I want you to document everything, every strange occurrence, every contact from the real estate company, every vehicle you don't recognize. And I'll talk to the other neighbors who received letters," Sarah added. "Maybe together we can figure out exactly what they're planning." As Detective Wilson prepared to leave, he gave Ellie his card and a small device that looked like a panic button. "If you feel threatened or see anything suspicious, press this button. It will send a signal directly to me." "Thank you," Ellie said, feeling slightly more secure, knowing that help was just a button press away. After Detective Wilson left, Sarah stayed for another hour, helping Ellie process everything that had happened. Tommy seemed to sense the tension in the room and was more clingy than usual, rarely leaving his grandmother's side. "I keep thinking about what you said," Sarah mused, "about how they used Rex's love for Tommy against him." "What do you mean?" "They knew that Rex would protect Tommy no matter what. They counted on it. But they didn't count on Tommy being so perceptive." Ellie looked down at her grandson, who was playing quietly with his blocks, but occasionally glancing toward the window as if he were keeping watch. "Do you think he understands what's happening?" she asked. "I think he understands more than we give him credit for," Sarah replied. "Children are often more intuitive than adults. He might have seen or heard things that we missed." As the afternoon wore on, Ellie found herself looking at Tommy with new eyes. His behavior since the incident had been unusually mature for an 18-month-old, and he seemed to be paying attention to things that normally wouldn't interest a toddler. Perhaps her grandson would be the key to understanding what Prestige Development Corporation was really planning for their neighborhood. The next morning brought both good news and troubling revelations. Dr. Morrison called early to report that Rex was showing signs of improvement and would likely be able to come home by the weekend. The relief in Ellie's voice was palpable as she thanked him repeatedly. "He's a strong dog with a strong will to live," Dr. Morrison assured her, "and I think he knows you need him at home." While Ellie was on the phone, Tommy crawled over to the front window and began pointing excitedly at something outside. When she hung up, she saw him pressed against the glass, babbling in his animated way. "What do you see, sweetheart?" she asked, joining him at the window. Tommy was pointing at Mrs. Henderson's house across the street, where a small crowd had gathered on the front lawn. Ellie could see Mrs. Henderson, the Johnson family, and several other neighbors she recognized, all talking animatedly and looking at papers in their hands. "I wonder what's happening," Ellie murmured, scooping up Tommy and heading outside to investigate. As she approached the group, Mrs. Henderson looked up with a worried expression. "Ellie, thank goodness you're here. We've all been comparing the letters we received from that real estate company." "What did you find?" Ellie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We've all received multiple letters over the past 6 weeks, explained Janet Johnson, the mother of the twin girls. But look at this. They're not just generic form letters. They contain specific information about our properties, our families, even our routines." She showed Ellie a letter addressed to her family. "They mention that we take the girls to school every morning at 7:30 that we have a 2-car garage, and that we've been considering renovating our kitchen." "How could they know about your kitchen renovation plans?" Ellie asked. That's what's so creepy," Janet's husband Mark added. "We only discussed it with the contractor who gave us an estimate last month. We never told anyone else." Mrs. Henderson held up her own letter. Mine mentions that I water my roses every morning at 8 o'clock and that I've been having trouble with my arthritis. The only people who know about my arthritis are my doctor and my sister in Florida. This is surveillance, Ellie said, feeling a chill run down her spine. They've been watching all of us for weeks. There's more, said Bob Peterson, the retired postal worker. I've been keeping track of unfamiliar vehicles in the neighborhood since yesterday. That white utility van has been parked on different streets every day for the past 2 weeks. Detective Wilson mentioned that van, Ellie said. He thought it might be connected to the real estate company. Detective Wilson, Mrs. Henderson asked. You contacted the police. Ellie quickly explained the events of the previous day, including the visit from Richard Blackwood and the discovery that Officer Stevens had been acting outside his authority. So this is an organized scheme, Mark Johnson said grimly. They're trying to force us all to sell. But why our neighborhood specifically? Janet wondered. There are lots of other areas they could develop. Tommy, who had been quietly observing the adult conversation, suddenly became animated again. He pointed toward the end of the street and babbled urgently. What is it, Tommy? Ellie asked, following his gaze. The white utility van was parked at the corner, and as they watched, they could see someone inside with what appeared to be a camera or binoculars. They're watching us right now, Bob Peterson said, his voice tight with anger. This is harassment. Mrs. Henderson declared, we need to do something about this. I have an idea, Ellie said, pulling out her phone. Sarah Wilson has been helping me document everything. She has a security camera at her flower shop, and she's been taking photos of suspicious vehicles. She called Sarah, who arrived within minutes with her laptop and several printed photos. I've been analyzing the patterns, Sarah explained to the group. The utility van appears on our street every day between 9 and 11 a.m., and then again between 3 and 5 p.m. The black sedans come at irregular intervals, but always after the van has been here. What do you think they're looking for? Janet asked. Our routines, Ellie replied. They want to know when we're home, when we're not, who visits us, when we take our children to school. And they've been using that information to personalize their letters, Mrs. Henderson added, making them more intimidating. Sarah pulled up another photo on her laptop. I managed to get a clearer picture of the van yesterday. Look at the license plate. The license plate was partially obscured, but enough digits were visible to run a search. Detective Wilson should be able to trace this, Ellie said. There's something else, Sarah continued. I talked to my friend Maria, who works at the city planning office. She said there's been a lot of quiet inquiries about zoning changes in our area. What kind of zoning changes? Bob Peterson asked. From residential to mixed-use commercial, Sarah explained. The kind of changes that would allow for large-scale retail or office development. So they're not just trying to buy our houses, Mark Johnson realized. They're trying to change the entire character of the neighborhood. But they can't do that without city approval, Mrs. Henderson pointed out. Not unless they can show that the current residential use is somehow problematic, Sarah said, like if there were reports of dangerous animals, property damage, or other issues that made the area unsuitable for families. The implications were staggering. So the incident with Rex was designed to create a paper trail, showing that our neighborhood is unsafe, Ellie said. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. And I'll bet if we investigate further, we'll find that other neighborhoods they've targeted had similar incidents right before the zoning changes were approved. Tommy, who had been sitting quietly in Ellie's arms, suddenly reached for Sarah's laptop. Before anyone could stop him, he had touched the screen and accidentally opened a different photo. Sorry, Ellie said, reaching to take the laptop away from him. He's too young to understand. Wait, Sarah said, looking at the screen. Look what he opened. The photo showed a wider view of the street, taken from a different angle. In the background, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was another vehicle none of them had noticed before. a dark blue SUV with tinted windows. "There's another surveillance vehicle," Bob Peterson said grimly. "They've been using multiple cars to watch us." "Tommy seems to notice things we miss," Janet observed. "Yesterday, when we were all talking, he kept pointing at things that turned out to be important." "Children often see things adults overlook," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "They're not distracted by adult concerns, so they notice details we miss." "Speaking of details," Sarah said, zooming in on the blue SUV, "look at this sticker on the back window." It was a small parking permit sticker, the kind used by employees at large corporations. "Can you make out the company name?" Ellie asked. "It looks like Meridian," Sarah said, squinting at the screen. "Meridian something." "Meridian Construction," Bob Peterson said suddenly. "Gee, I remember seeing that name on some building permits posted downtown last month." "So, Prestige Development and Meridian Construction are working together," Mark Johnson concluded. "This is bigger than we thought." "We need to share all of this information with Detective Wilson," Ellie said, "and we need to start documenting everything systematically." "I have a better idea," Mrs. Henderson said, with a determined look in her eyes. "We need to fight back." "What do you mean?" Janet asked. "They've been watching us, taking photos, learning our routines," Mrs. Henderson explained. "Why don't we turn the tables? We'll organize a neighborhood watch specifically to monitor their activities." "That's brilliant," Sarah said. "We'll create a schedule so someone is always keeping an eye on their vehicles. We'll photograph them, document their movements, and build our own case. And we'll make sure they know we're watching," Bob Peterson added. "Sometimes the best defense is a good offense." Over the next hour, they organized their counter-offensive. Mrs. Henderson would coordinate a communication network using a group text system. The Johnson family would handle the morning surveillance shift. Bob Peterson would take the afternoon shift, and Sarah would monitor from her flower shop during business hours. "What about me?" Ellie asked. "I want to help." "You're already helping more than you know," Mrs. Henderson assured her. "You discovered the connection between the fake police incident and the real estate pressure. Plus, you have Tommy." "Tommy? He's already proven he's better at spotting details than the rest of us," Sarah explained. "Children have a different perspective. They see things we miss because they're not filtering information through adult assumptions." As the group began to disperse, each neighbor now armed with a specific role in their surveillance operation, Ellie felt a mixture of determination and apprehension. They were no longer passive victims of whatever scheme Prestige Development had planned. They were organized, they were watching, and they were ready to fight for their neighborhood. But as she walked back to her house with Tommy in her arms, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something important. The people behind this scheme had been planning for months, had resources and connections that extended beyond their neighborhood, and had already demonstrated they were willing to put children at risk to achieve their goals. The real question was, what else were they willing to do? The neighborhood surveillance operation proved more effective than anyone had expected. Within 48 hours, they had documented a pattern of coordinated activity that painted a clear picture of the scope of the conspiracy against their community. Detective Wilson arrived at Ellie's house on Thursday evening with a thick folder of evidence and a grim expression. The entire neighborhood watch committee had gathered in her living room, with Tommy playing quietly in his playpen while the adults discussed their findings. "Your surveillance efforts have been incredible," Detective Wilson began, spreading photos and documents across Ellie's coffee table. "Combined with my investigation into Prestige Development and Meridian Construction, we now have a complete picture of what's been happening." He pulled out a map of their neighborhood with several properties circled in red ink. They've been systematically targeting specific houses for acquisition. Your house, Ellie, is right in the center of their desired development zone." "But why my house specifically?" Ellie asked. "Because it's the largest lot on the most desirable street," Detective Wilson explained. According to the zoning applications I found, they want to build a luxury shopping complex called Maplewood Commons. Your property would be the anchor location. A shopping complex? Mrs. Henderson gasped. In our residential neighborhood. It gets worse, Detective Wilson continued. I've traced the connections between Prestige Development, Meridian Construction, and several other companies. They're all subsidiaries of a larger corporation called Hartwell Enterprises, which is owned by Senator Richard Hartwell. The senator, Bob Peterson exclaimed, but he's supposed to represent our interests. Unfortunately, Senator Hartwell has been using his political connections to fast-track zoning changes and push through development projects that benefit his companies, Detective Wilson explained. He's done this in at least 6 other communities across the state. Sarah leaned forward, studying the documents. So that's why Officer Stevens was willing to participate. He was being paid by people with political power. Exactly. Stevens has been working as a freelance problem solver for Hartwell Enterprises. His job was to create incidents that would justify claims that neighborhoods were unsafe or unsuitable for families. And if Rex had been seriously hurt, or if something had happened to Tommy, it would have supported their case, Ellie said, her voice filled with anger. That was the plan, Detective Wilson confirmed, but they didn't count on your community organizing so effectively, or on Tommy's unusual ability to notice important details. As if responding to his name, Tommy looked up from his toys and crawled over to where the adults were sitting. He pointed at one of the photos on the table and babbled excitedly. "What's he pointing at?" Janet Johnson asked. The photo showed the white utility van parked on their street, but Tommy was pointing at something in the background that none of them had noticed before. "Look at the house behind the van," Sarah said, following Tommy's gesture. "There's someone in the window." Detective Wilson used a magnifying glass to examine the photo more closely. "You're right. There's definitely someone watching from that upstairs window." "That's the old Morrison house," Mrs. Henderson said. "It's been empty for 6 months since old Mr. Morrison moved to the nursing home. So they've been using vacant houses as surveillance posts," Detective Wilson realized. "Tommy, you're a better detective than most of my colleagues." The little boy clapped his hands and giggled, seeming to understand that he had helped solve an important puzzle. "There's more," Detective Wilson continued. "I've discovered that Hartwell Enterprises has been using a pattern of intimidation tactics across multiple communities. They create false emergencies, manufacture safety concerns, and then use those manufactured problems to justify zoning changes." "How do they get away with it?" Mark Johnson asked. "Money and political connections," Detective Wilson replied. "Senator Hartwell has friends in city government, in the police department, and in the media. He's been able to cover his tracks until now." "What changed?" Ellie asked. "You did," Detective Wilson said, looking directly at her. "Your community's response was different from the others. Instead of being intimidated into selling, you investigated, organized, and fought back. That's given us the evidence we need to expose the entire operation." "But what about Officer Stevens?" Sarah asked. "And is he going to face consequences?" "Stevens is already in custody," Detective Wilson announced. "We arrested him this morning on charges of impersonating a police officer, assault, and conspiracy to commit fraud." "Impersonating?" Mrs. Henderson asked, confused. "But you said he was a real police officer." "He was, but he was suspended at the time of the incident with Rex. Suspended officers are not authorized to carry weapons or act in any official capacity. What he did was illegal on multiple levels." "What about the real estate company?" Bob Peterson asked. "Richard Blackwood and the entire Prestige development operation have been shut down. We've frozen their assets and filed charges against everyone involved." "And Senator Hartwell?" Ellie asked. Detective Wilson's expression grew serious. "That's where things get complicated. We have evidence of his involvement, but prosecuting a sitting senator requires federal involvement. The FBI is now investigating his activities across multiple states. So he might get away with it, Janet asked. Not if we can help it, Detective Wilson replied, but it's going to be a longer process than the local cases. Tommy had been listening to the conversation with unusual focus for a child his age. Suddenly, he crawled over to Detective Wilson and offered him one of his toys, a small plastic telephone. "I think he wants you to make a phone call," Ellie said with a smile. "Actually, that's not a bad idea," Detective Wilson said, accepting the toy phone. "Tommy, you've been so helpful in this investigation. Do you have any other observations you'd like to share?" Tommy babbled seriously into the toy phone, as if he were conducting an important conversation. The adults all laughed, but there was something almost eerie about the child's apparent understanding of the situation. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "I think Tommy's been trying to tell us things all along. We just haven't been listening carefully enough. Children often understand more than we give them credit for," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "They see the world differently than adults do." "Speaking of seeing things differently," Detective Wilson said, "I have one more piece of information that might interest you all. The surveillance operation wasn't just about your neighborhood." He pulled out another map, this one showing a much larger area. Hartwell Enterprises has been targeting 7 different neighborhoods across the city for similar development projects. Your neighborhood was just the beginning. "So other communities are going through the same thing we experienced?" Ellie asked. "Some are, but most don't have the community organization you've developed here," Detective Wilson explained. "In fact, several of those communities have contacted me asking for advice on how to resist the pressure they're receiving." "What did you tell them?" Sarah asked. "I told them to do exactly what you did. Organize, document everything, and work together. Your neighborhood has become a model for community resistance." "But we're not done yet," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "We need to make sure this never happens again." "What do you have in mind?" Detective Wilson asked. "We're going to form a permanent neighborhood association," Mrs. Henderson announced. "We'll monitor any suspicious activity, maintain our communication network, and be prepared to help other communities that face similar situations. And we'll make sure Tommy gets the recognition he deserves," Bob Peterson added. "And without his observations, we might never have uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy." Tommy looked up at the sound of his name and smiled, as if he understood that he had played an important role in protecting his community. "There's one more thing," Detective Wilson said. "Rex should be able to come home tomorrow. Dr. Morrison says he's made a full recovery." "That's wonderful news," Ellie said, tears of relief in her eyes. "And I can't wait to bring him home. And I have a feeling Rex will be very interested in meeting all of his new friends in the neighborhood watch," Sarah added. As the meeting concluded and the neighbors prepared to leave, there was a sense of satisfaction and unity that hadn't existed before the crisis began. They had not only survived an organized attempt to destroy their community, but they had emerged stronger and more connected than ever before. Tommy, seemingly exhausted by his role as junior detective, had fallen asleep in his grandmother's arms. As Ellie carried him to his bedroom, she couldn't help but marvel at the events of the past week. Her quiet, predictable life had been turned upside down, but in the process, she had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed and formed bonds with her neighbors that would last a lifetime. The real victory, she realized, wasn't just stopping prestige development or exposing Senator Hartwell's corruption. The real victory was proving that ordinary people, working together, could stand up to powerful interests and protect what they valued most: their homes, their families, and their community. 3 months later, Maplewood Heights had transformed into something more vibrant and connected than anyone could have imagined. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their community had instead strengthened it in ways that continued to surprise everyone involved. The morning sun streamed through Ellie's kitchen window as she prepared breakfast for Tommy, who was now walking confidently around the house and chattering in his increasingly sophisticated toddler language. Rex lay contentedly on his favorite spot by the back door, fully recovered from his ordeal and seemingly more alert than ever to his surroundings. "Good morning, Detective," Ellie said to Tommy, who had developed a habit of pointing out interesting details during their morning routine. "What do you see today?" Tommy babbled excitedly and pointed toward the front window, where a small crowd was gathering on the sidewalk. But unlike the worried meetings of 3 months ago, this group was smiling and laughing, holding colorful signs and balloons. "Oh, that's right," Ellie said, scooping up Tommy. "Today is the big day." They walked outside to join their neighbors, who were preparing for the grand opening of the Maplewood Heights Community Center. The center had been established in the old Morrison house, which the neighborhood association had purchased and renovated using funds from a community development grant Sarah had discovered and applied for. "Morning, Ellie," Mrs. Henderson called out cheerfully. She was wearing a bright yellow shirt that read Maplewood Heights Neighborhood Watch, founded by a toddler, with a cartoon image of Tommy pointing at something important. "Good morning, Helen," Ellie replied, using her neighbor's first name. The formality that had once characterized their relationships had disappeared entirely during the months of working together. "Is our star detective ready for his big moment?" Sarah asked, approaching with a camera and a press badge around her neck. In addition to her flower shop, Sarah had started a neighborhood newsletter that had grown into a small but influential community publication. Tommy giggled and reached for Sarah's camera, a gesture that had become his trademark. His unusual ability to notice important details had been featured in several news articles about the Maplewood Heights case, and he had become something of a local celebrity. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Janet Johnson said, joining the group with her twin daughters. 6 months ago, we barely knew each other's names. Now we're planning community events and helping other neighborhoods organize their own watch programs. "That's the power of working together," Bob Peterson added. He had been elected as the first president of the Maplewood Heights Neighborhood Association and took his role seriously. "And when people unite for a common cause, amazing things happen." Detective Wilson arrived in his personal car, having become a regular participant in community events. "How's everyone doing on this historic day?" he asked, ruffling Tommy's hair affectionately. "We're ready," Mrs. Henderson announced. "The ribbon cutting is scheduled for 10 o'clock, and we have representatives from 3 other neighborhoods coming to see what we've accomplished." "And the media?" Detective Wilson asked. "Channel 7 is sending a crew, and the Cincinnati Enquirer wants to do a follow-up story about Tommy's role in exposing the conspiracy," Sarah replied. "He's become quite the celebrity detective." As if understanding the conversation, Tommy pointed toward the street where a news van was pulling up. His ability to spot relevant details had not diminished with time, and he seemed to enjoy his role as the neighborhood's unofficial observer. "Speaking of the conspiracy," Detective Wilson said, pulling Bob Peterson aside, "I have an update on the federal investigation." The entire group gathered around to hear the news. Over the past 3 months, the FBI's investigation into Senator Hartwell's activities had expanded to include similar schemes in 12 states. Though Senator Hartwell has been indicted on federal charges of conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of power, Detective Wilson announced. The investigation uncovered a network of corrupt officials, fake police officers, and fraudulent real estate companies operating across multiple states. "What about the other communities that were targeted?" Ellie asked. "That's the best part," Detective Wilson replied with a smile. 7 of the targeted communities have successfully organized resistance movements based on the model you created here in Maplewood Heights. They've all managed to stop the development projects and expose the local corruption. So Tommy's detective work has helped people in other states too, Mrs. Henderson said proudly. Absolutely. The FBI has asked for copies of all the evidence you gathered, and your surveillance techniques have been adopted by community organizations across the country. Tommy, who had been listening to the conversation with his characteristic focus, suddenly became animated and pointed toward the community center building. Through the window, they could see Dr. Morrison inside, setting up chairs for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "I think Tommy's reminding us that we have a celebration to attend," Ellie said. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by over 50 people, including residents from neighboring communities who had heard about the Maplewood Heights success story. Mayor Patricia Williams gave a speech praising the neighborhood's unity and determination. "The residents of Maplewood Heights have shown us what's possible when communities refuse to be intimidated," Mayor Williams said. "They've proven that ordinary citizens, working together, can stand up to powerful interests and protect what they value most." When it came time for the ribbon cutting, Tommy was given the honorary first snip, guided by his grandmother's hands. The crowd cheered as the ribbon fell, officially opening the community center that would serve as a model for neighborhood organization throughout the city. Inside the center, the walls were covered with photographs documenting the community's journey from crisis to triumph. There was a special display dedicated to Tommy's contributions, featuring enlarged photos of the images he had helped identify and quotes from Detective Wilson about the importance of seeing things from a child's perspective. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bob Peterson announced as the crowd gathered inside, "I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Jennifer Martinez from the University of Cincinnati's Community Development Program." Dr. Martinez, a small woman with kind eyes and an engaging smile, stepped forward to address the group. "I've been studying community organization for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you've accomplished here in Maplewood Heights." She gestured toward the wall displays. "What makes your story unique is not just that you successfully resisted an organized campaign of intimidation, but that you did it while maintaining your values of kindness, cooperation, and respect for each other. We learned that from Tommy," Mrs. Henderson said, looking down at the toddler who was now walking around the room, pointing at various displays with serious concentration. "That's exactly right," Dr. Martinez agreed. "Children often see solutions that adults miss because they're not constrained by adult assumptions about what's possible or what's proper." "Are there other communities that could benefit from learning about our experience?" Sarah asked. "Absolutely," Dr. Martinez replied. "In fact, I'd like to propose establishing the Maplewood Heights Institute for Community Organization. We could offer workshops, training programs, and consulting services to help other neighborhoods develop their own resistance strategies." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval from the crowd. Over the next hour, they discussed plans for expanding their influence and sharing their knowledge with communities across the region. As the afternoon progressed and the crowd began to thin out, Ellie found herself sitting in the community center's main room with Tommy on her lap, reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had all taken together. "You know what the most amazing thing is?" Sarah said, joining them with a cup of coffee. "We didn't just stop a development project. We created something better than what we had before." "What do you mean?" Ellie asked. "Look around," Sarah said, gesturing toward the room where neighbors were still chatting, children were playing together, and Rex was being petted by a group of admiring visitors. "Now, 6 months ago, we were strangers who happened to live on the same street. Now we're a real community. And it all started with Tommy noticing things that we missed," Ellie said, hugging her grandson close. Tommy looked up at her with his bright green eyes and babbled something that sounded almost like community. Did he just say community? Sarah asked in amazement. "I think he did," Ellie replied, her eyes filling with tears of joy and pride. As the sun began to set over Maplewood Heights, the last of the visitors made their way home. But the energy and hope that had filled the community center remained. The neighborhood that had almost been destroyed by greed and corruption had instead become a beacon of hope for communities everywhere. The little boy who had helped save their neighborhood was growing up in a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where children's voices were heard and valued, and where ordinary people had proven they could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together. Rex positioned himself protectively near Tommy, just as he had always done, but now his vigilance was supported by an entire community of people who had learned to see their neighborhood through the eyes of a child, with wonder, hope, and an unwavering belief in the power of working together. Dear friends, we hope the story of Ellie, Tommy, and the brave residents of Maplewood Heights has touched your hearts and inspired you to see the power of community in your own lives. This tale reminds us that sometimes the most important voices belong to those who see the world with fresh eyes, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they stand together. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to explore our special collection of community and family stories by clicking the link to your left. Each tale in our playlist explores the beautiful complexity of human relationships and the strength we find when we support one another. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed Tommy's detective adventure and his grandmother's courage. We bring you unique stories every day that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love and community. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own experiences with community and the unexpected heroes in your own neighborhoods. Thank you for joining us on this heartwarming journey, and we'll see you in our next story.